A quiet night, a small roadside diner. But when a group of dangerous men walks in, everything changes in an instant. One man sits in the corner unnoticed until it's too late. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Watch till the end to see how this night takes an unexpected turn. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories. Let us know in the comments. What would you do in this situation? The neon sign flickered in the rain, casting a dim glow over the small roadside diner. The storm outside had turned the asphalt into a glistening mirror, reflecting the occasional flash of headlights as cars passed on the highway. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, the air thick with the scent of coffee, grilled burgers, and toasted bread. The quiet hum of an old jukebox filled the space, playing a slow blues tune that barely rose above the murmur of conversations. Mike Lee stepped inside his entrance, going largely unnoticed. The small brass bell above the door chimed. Softly as he moved toward an empty booth in the corner, he was dressed simply a fitted black shirt, dark jeans, and a worn leather jacket. His presence was calm, unassuming. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself that hinted at a quiet confidence. He wasn't just another traveler, stopping in for a late-night meal. He was a man who had seen the world, who had lived through experiences few could understand, but tonight he wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted a meal and some peace. A waitress moved between tables, her steps quick and efficient. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, with dark curls pulled back into a ponytail. Her name tag read Maria. She moved with the tired grace of someone accustomed to long shifts, wiping down counters and balancing plates with ease. Yet something about her posture felt off. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes darting occasionally toward the entrance, as if expecting something unpleasant. Mike took in these details automatically. Years of training had sharpened his instincts to recognize tension in people, even when they tried to hide it. Maria finally approached his booth, pulling a small notepad from her apron. "Good evening. Sir, what can I get you?" Her voice was polite, but there was a strain in it, as if she were distracted by something else. Mike offered a small smile, a double burger, fries, and coffee. She nodded, jotting the order down, coming right up. She turned toward the kitchen, but Mike noticed the stiffness in her movements. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper, settling into his seat. Mike leaned back, stretching his legs slightly under the table. He wasn't a stranger to tension like this. He had spent enough time in places where fear lingered just beneath the surface. There was something unspoken in the air tonight, and he could feel it. The other patrons in the diner were quiet, hunched over their meals. Keeping to themselves, a trucker sat at the counter, flipping through a newspaper. An elderly man near the window stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. No one spoke louder than necessary, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. Mike noticed Maria's movements becoming slightly quicker, her eyes flicking toward the door more often. Then it happened. The front door slammed open, the bell above it jangling violently. A gust of cold air swept inside, bringing with it the smell of damp leather and cigarette smoke. 5 men strode in their heavy boots, thewing against the wooden floor. The atmosphere in the DER shifted immediately, conversations dying as heads ducked down. It was as if the entire room had collectively decided to make itself invisible. Mike didn't turn his head, but he didn't need to. He could feel their presence, the arrogance in their steps, the way they spread out slightly as they moved. They weren't here for food. Maria had gone rigid behind the counter, her knuckles whip in around the coffee pot she was holding. The leader of the group, a stocky, middle-aged man with graying hair and a deep scar across his cheek, surveyed the room with the air of someone who already owned it. His name was Rick, and his pale blue eyes settled on Maria with a smirk. Well, he drawled, stepping toward the counter. "Look who's still here." Mike saw it then, the way Maria's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. There was history here. Rick planted both hands down on the counter with a loud slap. "Thought you'd have learned by now, girl." Maria's voice was steady, though Mike could hear the edge in it. "Whatever you want, I'm not giving it to you." One of the other men, a lanky figure with a chipped tooth, let out a short laugh. "Oh, I think you will. Will you always do?" Eventually, Maria didn't move. "This is a business, not your playground." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. He reached out and plucked a sugar packet from the counter, rolling it between his fingers. "See, that's where you're wrong." He said, "This diner's on our territory, which means you pay if you want to keep it running. That's how things work." Around here, the tension in the room thickened, suffocating. Mike felt it pressing down like a heavy weight. He could see it in the way the other patrons kept their heads down, in the way Maria stood her ground, but with her hands trembling slightly. Fear was a familiar scent here, and Mike hated it. Maria lifted her chin. "I told you last time, I'm not giving you a damn cent." Rick sighed dramatically, tossing the sugar packet onto the counter. "See, I don't like that attitude. That kind of disrespect gets people into trouble." He turned slightly, glancing at his men. "Doesn't it, boys?" The chipped tooth biker grinned. "Oh yeah, big trouble." Another biker, a wiry man with a tattoo crawling up his neck, suddenly reached over and knocked a tray of silverware off the counter, sending a loud clatter of knives and forks onto the floor. Maria flinched Mike's grip on his coffee mug, tightened slightly. Rick leaned in closer to Maria, his voice dropping just enough to make the threat feel more personal. "You either pay up or bad." Things start happening. His voice was smooth, oily, like something sliding over gravel. Windows get broken, fires start, people get hurt, and then he reached for her wrist. Mike moved before he even thought about it. His hand shot out, catching Rick's wrist in a firm grip. It wasn't violent, but it was unyielding. A dead silence fell over the diner, the only sound the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. Rick turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing as he registered the strength in the grip that held him. His gaze traveled up, taken in the man sitting in the booth. The calm but unmistakably dangerous look in his dark eyes. One of the bikers whispered, That's Mike Lee." Mike didn't move. He didn't speak. His fingers dug just slightly into Rick's wrist. A silent message, a warning. Rick chuckled, but there was a slight edge of unease in it. "Now, well, damn," he mused. "Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity." The other bikers shifted, glancing at each other uncertainly. Mike spoke, then his voice quiet but firm. "You've had your fun now. Leave for a moment." Rick hesitated, his pride wed with common sense. The weight of Mike's grip on his wrist told him everything he needed to know. The other bikers were waiting for his call. Then something changed in Rick's expression. The hesitation vanished, replaced by something darker. He grinned. "You think being some big shot martial artist means something. In the real world," he yanked his arm free. "Stepping back, newsflash. Tough guy, this ain't the movies." The other bikers laughed, their unease evaporating. Mike remained unmoved. Rick cracked his knuckles. "All right, boys. Looks like we'll have to teach our Hollywood friend here a little lesson." Mike exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. The fight was coming, and Mike was ready. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from quiet tension to something far heavier. Almost suffocating, the presence of the five men was like a dark storm cloud settling over the room, and everyone inside seemed to shrink in its shadow. The few patrons who had been speaking fell completely silent. Their heads ducked down as they focused on their food or the swirling contents of their coffee cups. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with the men who had just entered. Mike remained still in his booth, his fingers lightly resting on the table. His expression unreadable. His posture was relaxed, but beneath that calm exterior, he was already assessing the situation, calculating the energy in the room, the positioning of each man, the way their bodies moved. Years of discipline had taught him to observe before acting, to let his opponents reveal themselves, and these men were already doing just that. Rick, the stocky, scar-faced leader of the group, carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had been in control for a long time. His pale blue eyes scanned the room, but they weren't searching for trouble. He already believed he was the trouble. His mouth curled into a slow smirk as he locked eyes with Maria, who stood stiffly behind the counter well. "Well," he said, stepping forward, his boots thung against the wooden floor, "if it ain't my favorite little waitress still working this dump." Maria said nothing, though her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Mike watched her closely. She wasn't just afraid, she was angry. Rick reached the counter and leaned over it slightly, his smirk widening. "Thought you'd learn by now. Thought maybe last time was enough to teach you a lesson." Maria's voice was steady, but the strain in it was unmistakable. I told you I'm not giving you anything. Rick's smirk faltered just for a second before he let out a chuckle. Oh, sweetheart, you still don't get how this works behind him. His men chuckled as well, their laughter low, and knowing one of them, a wiry man with a tattoo snaking up his neck, ran a hand through his greasy hair. Another, a lanky guy with a chipped tooth, cracked his knuckles loudly as if to punctuate Rick's words. This diner, Rick continued, his fingers drumming against the counter, is in our town, and in our town you pay for protection. That's just the way things go. Maria jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. I don't need your protection. I need you to leave for a moment. Rick said nothing, a smile disappeared from his face, and in its place came something colder. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. You don't get to say no, he said, his tone dripping with quiet malice. Not to us. Not in this town. Mike could see the way Maria's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. He could see how she forced herself to stand her ground, even though every muscle in her body was screaming at her to run. It was courage, not reckless, not foolish, just courage. And it was exactly the kind of thing men like Rick despised. One of Rick's men let out a low chuckle and took a step forward, placing a hand on a nearby table. She's getting mouthy again, he said, his voice laced with, um, mm, mm, maybe she needs a reminder. Maria's breath hitched slightly, but she didn't move. Mike exhaled quietly, watching Rick turn slightly, giving his men a lazy nod. The wiry man with the tattoo stepped forward first, reaching out and knocking over a tray of silverware. Knives and forks clattered loudly against the wooden floor, the sound making Maria flinch, though she didn't react. Otherwise, the lanky one grinned. Come on, sweetheart, you know how this works. Maria swallowed hard but didn't respond. Rick, seeing her continued defiance, sighed in exaggerated disappointment. You're making this real hard on yourself, he muttered then. In one smooth motion, he reached out and grabbed her wrist. It happened faster than any of them could react. 1 second, Rick's fingers were curling around Maria's wrist. The next, Mike's hand had shot out, seizing Rick's wrist in a grip that was neither violent nor forced, but completely unbreakable. The room froze, Rick's smirk twisted into confusion as he turned his head, his pale blue eyes locking onto Bruce. The pressure around his wrist increased slightly enough for the message to be clear, let go. The other bikers tensed, their amusement draining away as the reality of the situation settled in. A whisper came from one of the tables. That's Mike Lee. Mike didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply looked at Rick, his expression impassive, his grip firm but calm. Rick scoffed, though there was a flicker of something uneasy in his gaze now. Well, damn, he mused. Looks like we got ourselves a celebrity behind him. His men chuckled uncertainly, shifting on their feet. Mike spoke then, his voice quiet but clear. You've had your fun now. Leave for a moment. Rick hesitated. His pride was at war with common sense. He could feel the strength in Mike's grip. It wasn't the grip of some ordinary guy picking a fight. It was the grip of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The other bikers were watching him, waiting for his call. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the hesitation vanished. Rick pulled his arm free, stepping back, his smirk returning. You think being some big shot martial artist means something in the real world? He sneered. Newsflash, tough guy. This ain't the movies. The other bikers chuckled, their unease replaced by renewed arrogance. Mike remained completely still. Rick cracked his knuckles. All right, boys. Looks like we'll have to teach our Hollywood friend here a little lesson. Mike exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He hadn't wanted trouble tonight, but trouble had just found him. The tension in the diner thickened, like a storm cloud ready to burst. The air was heavy, suffocating, charged with an unspoken warning that something was about to happen. The other patrons had become mere shadows, shrinking into their seats, pretending they weren't there. Unwilling to meet the eyes of the 5 men standing in the center of the room, the hum of the jukebox continued, the slow blues tune, now sounding eerily out of place in the silence. Mike remained seated, his body still and relaxed, but his mind was already ahead of the situation he had encountered men like this before, ones who thrived on intimidation, who fed off of fear. They mistook silence for weakness and mistook kindness for submission. But their biggest mistake was assuming they knew how this encounter would play out. Rick took another step forward, rolling his shoulders, shaking out his arms, his smirk never faltering. "You really should have minded your business, buddy," he muttered, his voice dropping an octave lower, taking on a more menacing tone. "Now you're going to find out how things work around here?" Mike tilted his head slightly, observing him, the way Rick shifted his weight, the tension in his stance. He wasn't a trained fighter, he was a brawler. Someone used to throw in his weight around against people who never fought back. That would be his downfall. One of Rick's men, the wiry one with the neck tattoo, took the first step. He moved quickly, lunging forward in an attempt to grab Mike by the shoulder, thinking he could overpower him with sheer aggression. But Mike had already moved before the man's fingers even made contact with fluid precision. He pivoted, shifting just enough for the grasping hand to miss entire IRL. In the same motion, his arm shot out like a whip, striking the man in the ribs with the side of his palm. The impact was immediate and devastating. The biker's breath left his body in a strangled wheeze, and he stumbled backward, his face twisting in shock. The other men barely had time to react before Mike was already moving. The lanky biker with the chipped tooth rushed in next, swinging wildly, hoping to catch Mike off guard. Mike Sid stepped effortlessly, his movements economical, wasting no energy, as the biker's momentum carried him past. Mike delivered a swift, precise strike to the side of his knee. The man let out a strangled yell as his leg buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor. Rick's expression darkened as he realized this wasn't going the way he had expected. His grip on reality wavered, as his men who had swaggered in with confidence now groaned and writhed on the ground. The third biker, the burly one with the thick beard, hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a chair, lifting it high over his head and bringing it down toward Mike's back with all his strength. Mike heard it before it came, the scrape of wood against the floor, the shift in weight. He moved a split second before impact, twisting his body as the chair came down. Instead of striking him, it hit nothing but air. And before the biker could react, Mike struck his palm, shot forward, striking the man in the center of his chest with pinpoint accuracy. The impact sent him reeling, his grip loosening, the chair slipping from his fingers as he stumbled back, gasping for breath. Rick watched it all unfold, his eyes flicking between his fallen men and the man who had barely broken a sweat. His smirk had vanished, replaced by something closer to uncertainty, maybe even fear, but he was too deep now. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached into his jacket pocket, slipping something over his fingers, and when his hand emerged again, Mike saw the dull glint of brass knuckles. The remaining customers gasped, some instinctively, scooting further away from the unfolding fight. Maria's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the counter as she took a small step back. Rick flexed his fingers, curling them into a tight fist. "You're fast," he admitted, his voice lower now, rougher, "but let's see how fast you are when I put you down for good." Mike studied him, expression unreadable. He had fought men who wielded weapons before, knives, chains, even guns. A set of brass knuckles was a poor substitute for real skill. But it made one thing clear. Rick was desperate. He had seen his control slipping, and now he was trying to reclaim it. The only way he knew how, Rick moved in fast, throwing a brutal punch aimed straight for Mike's face. His strength was undeniable, but he lacked precision. Mike ducked just in time, feeling the rush of air as the fist passed inches above his head with a movement so swift it was almost imperceptible. Mike countered. His foot lashed out, striking Rick's shin, unbalancing him. And before Rick could recover, Mike's fist connected with his stomach in a sharp, controlled hit. The biker gasped, staggering back, clutching his midsection. The onlookers remained silent, their eyes darting between the fighters. Some had stopped pretending to ignore what was happening. Their awe unmistakable. Rick coughed, forcing himself upright, rage burning in his eyes. His pride was bleeding more than his body, and that was something he wouldn't tolerate. He lunged again, throwing another wild punch. This time, Mike didn't dodge. He caught Rick's wrist in midair, twisting it sharply. The biker let out a choked curse, his knees buckling slightly as pain shot through his arm. Mike's voice was calm, steady. "You've already lost." Rick's breath came in ragged bursts, his body still resisting what his mind had already accepted. Mike released his wrist, and for a moment there was no movement, the tension held suspended like a wire stretched too thin. Then with a slow, almost grudging realization, Rick took a step back. His chest heaved, his face twisted with frustration, but there was nothing left to do. His men were on the ground groaning, barely conscious. Maria exhaled sharply, her hands still trembling. But something else was in her expression now, something that hadn't been there before relief. The diner was silent. Once again, the jukebox hummed on, playing a tune that now felt strangely fitting. Rick finally spoke, his voice horror. "You think this is over?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite a snarl. "You don't know who you're messing with." Mike remained still, his gaze unwavering. Leave Rick hesitated, his body rigid. But there was nothing left for him. Here he glanced at his men, his jaw clenching as he realized they wouldn't be walking out of here with the same confidence they had walked in with. He took a slow, grudging step backward, then another. One by one, the bikers followed suit, dragging themselves to their feet, their movements sluggish and pained. The humiliation burned in their eyes, but they knew better than to test their luck further. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped outside, the storm still raging. Beyond the glass, Maria let it out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The other patrons sat motionless, as if waiting for confirmation that it was really over. Mike turned, glancing at Maria. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her voice was shaky. "Yeah, I think so." Mike gave a small nod before glancing toward the door. His expression was calm, but he knew the truth. This wasn't over. Rick's words weren't an empty threat. The fight may have ended, but the real battle was just beginning. The diner had turned into a battlefield the moment Rick stepped back, giving the signal. His men sprang into action. It was instinctual, the way they moved, fueled by years of taking what they wanted through fear and brute force. They had no strategy, no coordination, just raw aggression and the belief that overwhelming force would be enough to subdue a lone man. Mike had seen this before. He had faced men like this on the streets, in underground fights, in places where strength was valued above skill. He knew what was coming before they even moved. His body, honed through years of discipline, reacted faster than thought. The first attacker, the lanky man with the chipped tooth, lunged forward with a wide looping punch. It was reckless, full of blind fury, and Mike barely needed to move to avoid it. He stepped to the side, his body shifting with effortless grace. And as the punch sailed past him, he struck a single precise hit to the ribs. A palm strike delivered with speed and control. The force sent the man stumbling sideways. Gasping for breath, he was still standing, but just barely, before Mike could fully reset the wiry man. With the tattoo, took his chance, rushing in from the opposite side. He was slightly smarter, aiming low, trying to grab Mike by the waist in an attempt to tackle him to the ground, but Mike adapted instantly, using the man's own momentum against him. He sidestepped at the last second, gripping the biker's outstretched arm and redirecting him forward. The man's balance was thrown completely off, and with a fluid motion, Mike flipped him over his own body. The biker landed hard on his back with a dull thud, the air driven from his lungs. Rick growled in frustration, his eyes narrowing as he watched his men struggle. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being defied, and he sure as hell wasn't used to losing his hand. Clenched around the brass knuckles, still on his fingers, his chance would come. The burly biker, with the thick beard, charged next. This time more cautiously. He was larger than the others, built like a brick wall, and he had learned from their mistakes. He didn't swing wildly. Instead, he feinted left, then threw a heavy right hook aimed straight at Mike's jaw. Mike blocked it with minimal effort, absorbing the impact with his forearm. The moment of contact was enough for him to read the biker's strength. He was strong, no doubt, but slow. The split-second hesitation cost the man everything. Mike countered instantly, stepping in close, his movements smooth, practiced. A sharp strike to the solar plexus, followed by a swift elbow to the jaw. The biker reeled backward, staggering into a booth, his head snapping to the side as consciousness wavered. The chipped tooth man recovered enough to make another attempt, pulling a knife from his belt. His face twisted in desperation. Maria gasped, her eyes widening in horror as she saw the blade gleam under the dim lights. Mike saw it too. Knife fights were different. They weren't about strength. They were about angles, speed, and precision. A single mistake could be fatal. But he had trained for this, and the man holding the knife had not. The biker lunged the knife flashing toward Mike's torso in a reckless, stabbing motion. Mike evaded effortlessly, turning his body just enough for the blade to miss its mark. His counterattack was swift. His hand shot out one, gripping the biker's wrist, the other striking the nerve in his forearm. The knife clattered to the floor in one fluid motion. Mike twisted the man's wrist, forcing him down onto his knees. The biker let out a strangled yell, his free hand grasping at his arm in pain. Mike didn't let go. His grip tightened just enough to send a clear message: walk away. His voice was calm, steady, but there was no mistake in the weight behind it. The man hesitated, his pride battling against the sheer agony in his arm. Then with a strangled breath, he gave in. Mike released him, and the biker scrambled backward, his hand shaking as he cradled his wrist. He was done. That left Rick. Rick hadn't moved the entire fight he had watched, biding his time, waiting for an opening now. As his men groaned on the floor, his moment had arrived. His fingers curled tighter around the brass knuckles, and without warning, he launched himself forward. There was no pretense, no hesitation, just raw fury. He swung with everything he had, the metal glinting as it cut through the air, aimed directly at Mike's head. Mike ducked the punch, missed by an inch, the force of it carrying Rick forward, his balance thrown off. Mike capitalized instantly, stepping to the side and delivering a lightning-fast kick to the back of Rick's knee. The biker let out a sharp grunt as his leg buckled, but he didn't fall. Rick recovered quickly, faster than Mike had expected, twisting his body and swinging again this time. Mike blocked it, catching Rick's wrist mid-motion. The moment their arms locked, Mike could feel the raw power behind the strike. Rick was stronger than the others, but strength alone wouldn't be enough. Mike twisted his grip, applying just enough force to make Rick grimace. Then, with absolute precision, he struck a short, brutal hit to the ribs, quick, controlled, efficient. Rick gasped, his grip on the brass knuckles loosening slightly. Mike didn't stop. He moved with calculated speed, delivering a second strike. This time to Rick's shoulder. The impact sent the biker stumbling backward, his hand now barely holding on to the brass knuckles. For the first time that night, Rick looked afraid. Mike took a slow step forward. His breathing, even his eyes, locked onto Rick's. "It's over," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. Rick's chest heaved as he took a shaky step back. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his gaze. But he couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of everyone. His eyes darted toward the door. A possible escape. Mike saw it before it happened. The slight shift in weight, the quick inhale. Rick ran, or at least he tried to. Mike moved faster. He closed the distance in the blink of an eye, cutting off Rick's escape. With a single fluid motion, his foot shot out, sweeping Rick's legs out from under him. The biker hit the floor hard. The breath knocked from his lungs. The brass knuckles clattered onto the ground beside him. Mike crouched down slightly, his gaze steady. Rick gasped for air, coughing, but there was no fight left in him. Not anymore. Maria stood behind the counter, her breath uneven, her hands still gripping. The edge. She had seen a lot of things in her time working here, but nothing like this. The diner was silent again. Mike exhaled, standing up straight. He turned his head slightly, scanning the room. The fight was over. Rick's men lay groaning, beaten on the floor. The storm outside raged on, but inside something had shifted. The fear that had once hung over this place like a heavy fog had begun to lift. Rick coughed again, rolling onto his side. His voice was hoarse, bitter. "You're going to regret this." Mike's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said simply. "I won't." Outside, the sound of distant sirens cut through the rain. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the diner's window, signaling the arrival of the police. Mike looked down at Rick one last time before turning toward Maria. "Are you okay?" Maria let out a shaky breath and nodded. "Yeah," she said, her voice steadier now. "I think I am." Mike gave a small nod, but in the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't over yet. The rain outside had turned into a downpour, heavy droplets striking the diner's windows and rhythmic taps. The neon sign flickered in the storm, casting a dim red glow over the soaked pavement. Inside the diner was eerily quiet. The wreckage of the fight lay scattered across the floor. Overturned chairs, a broken salt shaker spilling across the counter, silverware glinting under the dim overhead lights, the jukebox once playing. Its slow blues melody had been knocked slightly off its place, the music skipping in and out as if trying to process what had just happened. Rick lay on the floor, still gasping for breath. His body curled slightly from the pain. His men were in no better shape. Groaning and trying to regain their footing, the smell of sweat and adrenaline lingered in the air, mixing with the warm scent of coffee and grilled food. It was a strange combination, one that didn't quite belong. Maria stood behind the counter, her hands gripping its surface so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her breathing was uneven, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to process everything. The fear was still there, lingering in her bones, but something else had begun to settle in, something unfamiliar. But welcome, Mike remained exactly where he had been standing. His breathing controlled his posture, steady his gaze didn't leave Rick watching. Waiting, he knew the fight was over physically, but men like Rick weren't the type to admit defeat so easily. There was always something left, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim power. The silence was finally broken by the sound of Rick coughing, a deep guttural noise, as he tried to pull himself into a sitting position. His hands pressed against the floor, his body trembling from both pain and humiliation. He spit onto the wooden surface, shaking his head slightly, his pale blue eyes flicking upward. There was no longer confidence in them, no arrogance, just rage. You think this means something? Rick's voice was horror, but the venom in it was unmistakable. You think you did something here? Mike said nothing. He didn't need to. Rick let out a bitter chuckle, wincing as he touched his ribs. You don't know who you're messing with. His gaze flickered toward Maria, and the smirk that curled on his lips was enough to make her stomach twist. You think this is over? You think locking me up is going to change anything? He coughed again, shaking his head. I got people, sweetheart, people who don't like it when one of their own gets put down. Maria swallowed hard. She knew he wasn't bluffing. The weight of his words settled into her chest. But then as she glanced toward Mike, she saw something in his eyes, something steady. Unshaken, Rick caught the look and scoffed. You think he's going to protect you? What, he going to camp out in your little diner forever? He smirked, though it was weak. Nah, he'll leave. And when he does, we'll be back. Mike exhaled slowly, finally speaking. You won't be back. His voice was calm, controlled yet absolute. Rick narrowed his eyes. You really think you're going to stop me? Mike took a slow step forward. Rick flinched, and the sight of it made his own anger flare, as if he hated himself for the reaction. But he couldn't help it. The pain, the humiliation, the sheer powerlessness he felt in that moment, it was all too much. Mike crouched slightly, just enough so that they were at eye level. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. You've spent years making people afraid of you. You think that's power. He shook his head, but fear is fragile. The second someone stands up, it falls apart. Rick clenched his jaw. Mike continued. Look around. No one here is afraid of you anymore. Rick glanced toward the other patrons, the trucker who had been hiding behind his newspaper, the elderly man near the window, the woman clutching her purse. They were all watching now, no longer pretending not to see, no longer shrinking away. Rick's lips pressed together into a thin line. He looked back at Mike. You're making a mistake, he muttered. Mike's expression didn't change. No, you made the mistake. The second you walked through that door, a sudden burst of red and blue lights flooded. Through the windows, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, closer, before finally cutting off, as police cruisers skidded to a stop just outside. The flashing lights reflected against the rain, slicked pavement, casting eerie shadows across the diner's walls. The front door swung open. 2 officers stepped inside their uniforms, damp from the rain, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters as they scanned the room. The older of the 2, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a stern face, took in the scene. The broken furniture, the battered bikers, the way Rick lay on the floor. Like a man who had just realized he was truly defeated, the officer sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Well, if it ain't Rick Dawson, he muttered, his gaze flicked toward Maria. They given you trouble again. Maria straightened slightly, her voice firmer than she expected. They came in demanding money again when I refused. They started threatening me. She hesitated, then added, "They attacked first." The officer nodded unsurprised. He glanced at his partner. "Call it in extortion, assault, property damage." Rick let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "This is bull, shut up." "Rick," the officer interrupted, kneeling down to slap a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "You know how this goes. One by one, the other bikers were hauled to their feet. Some groaned in protest. Others hung their heads in exhausted defeat." The officer turned toward Mike, studying him for a long moment. "You the one who did all this?" Mike didn't answer immediately. He simply met the officer's gaze. Then he shrugged. "They started it." A chuckle came from the trucker near the counter. "Damn right, they did," he muttered, shaking his head. The officer smirked slightly before nodding. "Appreciate what you did here?" He paused, "But I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a statement." Mike glanced toward Maria, then back at the officer. "You have witnesses and cameras." The officer's gaze lingered on him before he finally nodded. Fair enough. He looked back at Rick, who was still scowling. "Anything else you want to say?" Rick hesitated, his jaw tightening, then with a slow, grudging realization, his shoulders sagged. The officer took that as his answer. "All right, get them out of here." One by one, the bikers were dragged toward the exit, their boots scuffing against the floor as Rick passed by Maria. He lifted his gait, gazed slightly, his lips curling in what should have been a smirk, but no longer held any power. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Maria didn't. Flinch. Mike stepped forward slightly, just enough to block Rick's view. The biker tensed instinctively. "You won't be back," Mike repeated, and this time Rick didn't have a response. The door swung shut behind them, and just like that the storm had passed, the tension, the fear, the weight that had hung over this place for so long, it was gone. Maria exhaled slowly for the first time in a long time. She felt free. She turned to Mike, her voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, Mike," simply nodded outside. The police cruisers pulled away, their sirens, silent, their presence lingering in the air, like a fire warning the diner was a mess. Broken furniture, shattered glass. But for the first time in years, it belonged to its people again. Maria straightened her shoulders. "I guess I should start cleaning up." Mike smirked slightly. "I'll take that burger now." Maria let out a breath, shaking her head with a small laugh. For the first time, things finally felt right. The police cars were gone. The flashing red and blue lights that had once illuminated the rain-soaked pavement had faded into the night, leaving only the echo of sirens in the distance. The diner stood still, its once suffocating atmosphere now eerily quiet, as if the storm that had raged inside had finally passed the few remaining customers. Those who had witnessed everything sat in stunned silence, their eyes flicking between the wreckage left behind and the man who had single-handedly dismantled a group of bikers without breaking a sweat. Maria stood behind the counter, her hands resting on its worn surface. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, though not from fear. It was the kind of trembling that came after too much adrenaline, the body struggling to return to normal after bracing for some far worse. She had spent so much time living in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next time Rick and his men would walk through that door. But now, for the first time, she could breathe. Mike remained where he was seated at his booth. Calm as ever, his posture was relaxed, but his eyes remained sharp. Taken in the room, reading the energy of the people around him, he had been in situations like this before. Places where fear had long dictated the rules, where people had been forced into submission simply because they believed they had no other choice. He had always known that fear was a fragile thing. It crumbled the moment someone stood up against it, and now, sitting here in the aftermath, he could see it happening. Maria let it out a slow breath and finally spoke well. That was something. The trucker who had been sitting near the window let out a dry chuckle that was more than something, sweetheart. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Ain't never seen anyone take down Rick and his boys like that. Hell, I didn't think anyone could." Maria glanced at Mike. "Yeah, well, guess we had the right guy here tonight." Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. "It wasn't about the right guy," he said, finally, his voice even. "It was about the right moment." Maria frowned, slightly tilting her head. What do you mean? Mike leaned back, studying her. They came in here because they thought they could. Because no one had ever told them no. That's why they kept coming back. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table tonight. That changed. Maria swallowed, looking down at the counter. She knew he was right. For so long, she had convinced herself that giving in was the safest option, that if she just played along, if she just kept her head down, maybe they wouldn't push too far. But it had never been enough. The trucker let out another chuckle. Well, far as I see it, you just did this whole town a favor. He shook his head. Rick's been running his little operation for years. Everyone's been too scared to stand up to him. Maybe now that he's been humiliated, he'll think twice about coming back. Maria let out a dry laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. Yeah, or maybe he'll come back pissed off. A heavy silence followed her words. It was the unspoken truth that lingered in the back of her mind, that had been lingering since the moment Rick spat his last threat before being dragged out of the diner. She had seen his face, seen the anger burning behind his pale blue eyes. People like him didn't just let things go. Mike met her gaze, his expression unreadable. If he comes back, you'll be ready. Maria scoffed, shaking her head. You really think I stand a chance against guys like that? Mike's response was immediate. You stood a chance tonight. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. He wasn't wrong. She had stood her ground. She had refused to give in even when every instinct told her to. And because of that, the entire course of the night had changed. The trucker nodded in agreement. He's got a point. You did what most folks around here have been too scared to do for a long time. He smirked slightly. Hell, I'd say you're braver than half the men I know. Lauren let out a small laugh, though this time it felt real. She shook her head. Brave or stupid, guess we'll find out. Mike finished the last sip of his coffee before setting the mug down. Gently, bravery and stupidity aren't as different as people think. The only real difference is in the outcome. The weight of his words settled over her for the first time. She wasn't sure if she had made a mistake or not. But what she did know was that she had done something, and that in itself felt like a victory. The other customers began to move again, shaking off the stiffness that had come from staying too still for too long. A few murmured among themselves, stealing glances at Mike, as if still trying to process what they had witnessed. Others finished their meals in silence, as if pretending nothing had happened would somehow make the night feel normal again. Maria exhaled and turned toward the mess. Left behind the broken furniture, the scattered plates and overware. It was a disaster, but it was her disaster. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the power to fix it. She grabbed a rag and began wiping down the counter, her movements slow but steady. Guess I better start cleaning this up. Mike smirked slightly, and I guess I'll take that burger now. Maria paused, then let out a small laugh. After all, that you still want a burger? Mike nodded. A fight makes you hungry. She shook her head, already moving toward the grill. All right, one burger coming up. As she worked, something inside her felt lighter. The fear, while still there, no longer felt like a weight crushing her. It was still present, but it no longer controlled her. The trucker leaned back in his seat, watching her with an approving nod. Got to say, you're handling this better than I expected. Maria smirked. What, you thought I'd be curled up in the corner crying? He shrugged. Not necessarily, but I figured you'd be shaken up more. She was, but she wasn't about to let that show. Mike watched her for a moment before standing. He stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last remnants of the fight. I should be going soon. Maria hesitated mid-motion. She wasn't sure why, but the idea of him leaving so soon made her stomach twist slightly. You heading somewhere specific? Mike shook his head. Just passing through. She just swallowed down whatever disappointment she felt and nodded. Well, wherever you're going, thanks for everything. Mike met her gaze and gave a small nod. Take care of yourself. Before she could respond, the bell over the door jingled as it swung open. This time, it wasn't another threat. It was a young cop, the same one who had helped arrest Rick. He walked up to the counter and placed a card down. In case you need anything. He said, we'd be keeping an eye on things, but just in case. Maria picked up the card, running her thumb over the printed number. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. Mike glanced at the card, then back at her. Looks like you've got backup now. Maria smirked. Guess. So Mike nodded once more before finally turning toward the door as he stepped outside. The rain had begun to lighten, the storm finally passing. Maria watched him go, her fingers tightening around the cop's card. She didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid the diner was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy silence of fear that had once settled over this place. Every time Rick and his men walked through the door, it wasn't the kind of quiet that made people shrink in their seats, pretending they didn't see what was happening. This quiet was lighter, filled with something unspoken, something new. The aftermath of the fight still lingered in the air, in the scattered chairs and the broken glass that reflected the flickering neon lights. But there was no tension, no fear. Maria stood behind the counter, the warmth of the freshly brewed coffee filling the space around her. She had started cleaning up as soon as the police had left, trying to restore some sense of normalcy to the place. The trucker near the window had stayed behind, occasionally commenting on the mess, but mostly watching in silence. The few other customers who had remained throughout the chaos had started speaking again, their voices hushed, almost reverent, as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Mike had taken his time finishing his birth burger. He didn't rush, didn't seem in any hurry to leave. He ate with the same calmness, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had allowed him to take down 5 men without breaking a sweat when he was finished. He pushed his plate forward slightly, took one last sip of his coffee, and then leaned back against the booth. Maria finally turned to him, wiping her hands on her apron. "So is that it?" she asked. "You just eat your burger and go?" Mike smirked slightly. "That was the plan." Maria scoffed, shaking her head. "Right. Because that's just a normal night for you." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then finally he shrugged. "It's not about the night, it's about the moment?" Maria Farr frowned slightly. "What does that even mean?" Mike gestured vaguely to the space around them. "This place, these people, Rick and his crew, they all played their roles tonight. They all made choices, some out of fear, some out of habit, some because they thought they could." He exhaled slowly. "You made a choice too?" Maria's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. "Yeah, and what choice was that?" Mike met her gaze. "You didn't back down." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "Didn't feel like much of a choice at the time." Mike smirked. "It never does." The words sat between them for a moment, weighty and real. She didn't know why, but something about what he was saying stuck with her deeper than she expected. She had spent so long believing that there were only 2 options, survive or suffer. But tonight she had chosen something else. She had stood her ground. The trucker finally spoke up from his seat. "So what happens now?" Maria exhaled, glancing at the wreckage around her. Now she sighed, rubbing her temples. "Now I guess I clean up, go home and see if my job still exists tomorrow?" The trucker snorted. "Girl, after what you pulled tonight, you should own this damn place." Maria smirked but didn't respond. The truth was, she had no idea what would happen next. She didn't know if Rick really would be back. She didn't know if she had just painted a target on her back by standing up to him. But what she did know was that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. Mike reached into his pocket, pulling out a few bills and sliding them across the counter. Maria frowned, glancing at the money. "What's this for Mike?" Raised an eyebrow, the burger. Maria let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "After all that, you really think you have to pay for your meal?" Mike tilted his head slightly. "You still worked for it, didn't you?" She studied him for a moment before finally taking the money, folding it carefully before tucking it into the register. "All right, fine, but if you ever come back, your next meal's on the house." Mike gave her a small nod. "I'll hold you to that." He stood up, rolling his shoulders slightly as if shaking off the last remnants of the fight. Maria watched as he moved toward the door, his steps unhurried, his presence still commanding. Even in something as simple as walking away just before he reached the exit, he turned back to her. "Rick's kind of guy, he'll try to come back." Mike said, his voice was steady, matter of fact. Maria swallowed but didn't look away. "Yeah, I figured." Mike studied her for a moment before nodding slightly. "But next time you'll already know what to do." And with that, he pushed the door open. Stepping out into the rain, Maria watched him go, standing behind the counter, as the bell above the door jingled. Softly, she didn't know if she would ever see him again. She didn't know if she even wanted to. But one thing was certain, she would never forget this night. She glanced down at the counter at the space where his coffee mug had been, then exhaled, shaking her head slightly. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear the rain, no longer pounding against the pavement, but settling into a soft drizzle, the neon light in the window flickered, still struggling to stay lit. Maria turned back to the mess she had left unfinished, rolling up her sleeves. She had work to do. The fight is over, but the real question remains, what happens next? Fear ruled this place for too long, but tonight everything changed. Would you have stood up or stayed silent? If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in this situation? Let's talk about it.